Welcome to the 8th chapter of the book of 1 Samuel. Samuel was in control of the sons of Israel. After the death of Eli and his two sons, and the Ark of the Covenant was taken by the Philistines, then it was brought back, and then in the 7th chapter, basically, it shows how Samuel grew in spiritual strength and I guess you would call it strength of the government of Israel. He was considered a judge, and he was also a prophet. But as Eli found out, if you don't take care of your children and bring them up right and discipline them, then bad things can happen. And Eli's two sons were killed by the Philistines when the two sons decided to bring the ark up to the army when they attacked the Philistines. And now we see where Samuel's sons also have a problem. And as I mentioned, the Greeks have a saying, priest's son, devil's grandson. It begins, and it came to pass as Samuel grew old, that he placed his sons as dikastas in Israel, magistrates. So I suppose these sons would have been the last judges, because it says they were magistrates, which is a judge. And these are the names of his sons. The firstborn was Eoel, or Joel, and the name of the second, Thevteru, Deuteronomy comes from that, Abiah. There are magistrates in Beersheba, which was way farther south. Probably other magistrates throughout the area, other than just these two here. So basically, these were judges in a certain area. As far as who was over the whole country, the tabernacle was still around, and the priesthood, but it doesn't really talk too much about that. It's more about Samuel, who I don't believe he was ever considered a high priest. I could be wrong on that, but I can't remember where he would be called a high priest. But anyway, it says, and his sons went not in his way, and turned aside after the contribution, that is, the money coming in, spend it on their own personal wants, and they took bribes if they were a judge, they took money to let the people off. If they were convicted of stealing or arrested for stealing, and they could bribe their way out with these two sons, and they turned aside ordinances and all these things. I think this is the last we'll hear of them. So the result of this, remember, Samuel is now old. And the men of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel in Ramah. And we showed that where that was at there in the last chapter, the map. And they said to him, well, I think I even have it here still. There's Ramah right down in here. And Jerusalem, there is straight above Jerusalem, looks like maybe 20 miles or so. Jerusalem is a very small country. And they said to him, behold, you grow old, and your sons go not in your way. And now place over us a king to adjudicate for us as all the nations. The country of Israel was basically a theocracy. God was the ruler, and he had a priesthood underneath him who were in contact with God through the Urim and the Thummim, the high priest, and through the rituals and sacrifices and all the things that were for the temple. This was basically the way it was set up after Moses. It continued during the time of the judges, but it doesn't mention in the judges too much of what happened in this tabernacle is pretty much void of any information like that. But then in the beginning of Samuel, it goes into the tabernacle with Eli. Now, being a country that didn't have a civil ruler, it was more of a religious ruler. Today, about the only country in the world that I can think of that is like that would be the country of Iran, who is run by they call them the mullahs, I believe, and they are religious clerics in the Muslim religion. So kings, though, were around. The kings were around even when it talks about Abraham and warring against the kings of the 4 kings against the 5 in the book of Genesis. So kings are mentioned early. One man who is the ruler. Some countries had a queen. The Queen of Sheba, which came from Saba, which is, they think, and pretty sure it's today's Yemen. And she came, and she was a ruler, but there was also kings there, and they were the rulers of the people. But all these countries with kings, they have all sorts of different rules. In Saba, the king, once he became initiated as the king, then he stayed in his palace and could never leave it for the rest of his life. So all these different things that were going on with kings, apparently the people of Israel saw kings with the, I'm not sure if the Palestinians they had satraps, but the king, well, Greece was around, I believe. I don't even know if Greece had a king, but whatever kings were around, they wanted to replicate what they were doing. For some reason, they liked that, didn't want God to be over them, basically, and maybe thinking that it would be easier for them to have a king who is not a religious person. And then, so we see the institution then of the kingdom later on in the next chapter, and it goes all the way down until the time that the Jews were taken out of Israel and went into Babylon. So they now say they want this king. And it says, and the matter was wicked in the eyes of Samuel, as they said, give to us a king to adjudicate for us. Basically didn't want the Samuel to adjudicate, or the sons and other people. Somehow they wanted a king. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, well, hearken to the voice of the people, as whatever they should speak to you. Akue, hearken. Acoustics and phone, these words go together in a lot of places. And there should be an imperative there. So hearken to the voice. Do it. For it is not you they treat with contempt, but only me they treat with contempt, to not reign over them. So apparently these people didn't have a close relationship with God. It was through a priesthood, and a lot of it people couldn't do anything themselves. They had to go through a priesthood. And I suppose maybe they thought it would be better with somebody that they could deal with more, rather than somebody that was inside of a tent that only one person could go in once a year. So God's saying, well, they're treating me with contempt. They don't want God to reign over them, according to all the works which they did to me, from which day I led them from out of Egypt. So he's now going back, and basically they didn't want God a lot of times to rule over them, a rebellious people, and I believe still are, and until this day, even as they abandoned me and served other gods, so they do also to you. So idolatry was rampant with Israel had these other gods, and generally they took a form of some type of a statue of clay or gold, silver, or whatever. And people would put these little gods in niches in the walls in their houses and places, and outside they had special areas, sacred groves, and they would serve to these gods, and they would have initiations. A lot of it had to do with fertility rites, sex, orgies, and so forth, that they would be involved in, which maybe was pleasurable to them for a time. And so they had a history of doing this. They went to Baal Peor, where the people in there seduced the sons of Israel. And he continues and says, "And now hearken to their voice," in the imperative, "only that in testifying you should testify to them, and you shall report to them the ordinance of the king, which shall reign over them." So, okay, let him have it, but here's the ordinance, and this is being set up by God. "And Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people, asking of him for a king." So, okay, there it is. "And he said, This will be the ordinance of the king reigning over you. Your sons he shall take and put them in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they shall run in front of his chariots." Well, that would be like an armed guard around the king, personal armed guard, but they were also put into his army, and he did have armies. "And he will appoint them to himself as commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, and to plow his plowing." So work his fields. He's going to own land, and whatever he grows will be his, and to harvest his harvest, and to gather the vintage of his gathering the grape crops, and to make items for his warfare. So first we have the plowing of the fields, and then they would harvest it after it grew, and gather the wine or the grapes from the crops, make wine and so forth, all for this king, and then to make items for his warfare and items for his chariots. So this king now can go to war whenever he wants, and he'll have horses and chariots. Armaton, we have arma, comes from that. Armistice, arma, what else is arma? No, I can't think of it. But, and your daughters he will take for perfumers. So they'll work for things and give for the king, have these wonderful scents for his beautiful clothes. And they'll be for cooks and for baking. And bakers, cooks, do all these things just for this one man. And your fields and your vineyards and your good olive groves he will take, and he will give to his bondmen. So basically the king will have a lot of power. He will be able to take land, move people around, start wars, all sorts of things like that, and went on down for thousands of years until the 20th century, the early 20th century, maybe even the late 19th century, where the Dutch became a republic. Holland became a republic. And then the kings of France, Spain, England, all the European kings were basically pretty much deposed. Spain with in the 40s and the 30s rather, with the dictator Franco, caused the king to abdicate, and the French earlier in the early 1800s, maybe the late 1700s, killed their king, beheaded him in the French Revolution. The Germans lost their king after the First World War. It was William II, and he he abdicated because the Germans lost the First World War. At the same time, in Russia, the Tsar was overtaken by the communists with Lenin and Trotsky and these other people. Victor Emmanuel in Italy, I'm not exactly sure when the Mussolini came in, and the kingdom didn't mean much to Italy. But there are still some kingdoms in Europe. And of course, in Asia, there are kings, rulers. And then in Japan was a emperor, but he lost most of his power after the Second World War when they lost to the United States. But all these kings were very powerful at one time. They pretty much ruled the world and certain parts of the world with the colonialism, where they went into Africa and Asia and the Americas and took land and fought with each other. So this all things were happening, and so this is going to be basically what the history of Israel from now on. And then it continues, and the seeds of yours he will take a tenth. Well, that's pretty good rate. Tenth, I mean, not high, but that's not bad. I think in the United States, my taxes were, selling Bibles. I think I was almost 15%, if I'm not mistaken. But now, with this time of the virus, coronavirus, are talking about giving everybody $1,200. So that'll help my past year's taxes. But they would pay a tenth of your vineyards, so whatever they grew, wine, he will give to his eunuchs. And that are the castrated males, who were like slaves around the king, who had harems with women, had a lot of wives, and these eunuchs would protect the wives from anybody coming in and wanting to debauch himself with the harem of the king. And he will give it, and his bondmen, his servants, basically, were all taken care of. And your bondmen, and your bondwomen, and your good herds, and your donkeys, he shall take. And he will take a tenth for his works. So he could take the men and women to do work, sort of like the United States during the war. They had the different wars. They had the draft, where the government had the right to put somebody into the army or navy or whatever. And he will take a tenth of your flocks, of the wool and sheep, and you will be to him for bondmen. And you shall yell in that day from the face of your king, of which you chose for yourselves. You're going to yell because all the things that he'll be taking and doing are going to be way worse than where it was under God. This is what God is predicting. And the Lord will not heed you in those days. Well, he didn't and he didn't. It says he's not going to heed them, but yet he did, because the kingdoms lasted hundreds of years. Many kings, some good ones and a lot of bad ones. The country was split up between the northern and the northern 10 tribes of Israel, and the bottom 2 tribes, Benjamin and Judah, the country of Judah. So the Lord not heeding him, well, he did heed David and other kings, but there's a place, I suppose, here that God is not going to heed. I'm not exactly sure. A few things here I was like, this is kind of questionable, but the idea is that God didn't want them to do this, but he allowed it to happen, and it happened. And as the kingdom took place. And the people willed not to hearken to the voice of Samuel. And they said to him, not so, but let let it be that a king will be over us. So what? Okay, but it's not going to be as bad as you're making it out. And we also will be as all the nations. Now, why they wanted to become like all the nations, I'm not exactly sure. But there are still, in politics, peoples that want certain governments. A lot of people want communism still. Even after it failed in the Soviet Union and other places, they still think that this is a viable economic system, and they want to be like, I guess, communist nations. China is a communist nation, Vietnam. And our king shall adjudicate for us, that is, be a judge, and shall go forth in front of us, and war, everything, he's on the top, and will wage our war. And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he spoke them into the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, well, hearken to their voice, and let a king reign unto them. And Samuel said to the men of Israel, well, let each man run to his city. In the imperative, run to your city. It's going to happen, okay? Get ready. We'll do something about it. Now, not wanting God to reign over them, but a king instead, we can look today and see now that most people expect the government to do all the things for them. It's not a kingdom, but government, whatever form of government. It replaces God. God will bless the people that love him, and if the people love him, then they'll do the things that he says. Obey God. But now we don't have a theocracy, but we do have a government. And the problem is the government can say certain things that God, the opposite of what God would say. God says, do not commit adultery. And homosexuality is, there was a death sentence for it. I'm not saying it should today, but these are the things that God had said, his laws and rules, and obeying him. But now the government can take these things away and say, oh, it's okay. There's nothing, if you commit adultery, that has nothing to do with God. Same-sex marriages, that would be a anathema to God, but yet the government allows same-sex marriages. So when we allow the government to take over and depend on it for everything, it may sound okay, but as we see this week, everything came to a giant close, slammed shut. All economy, now it's been for 2 weeks, don't know how long it's going to be, but governments have failed, kings have failed. The Soviet Union had this idyllic economic system everybody would share, and it didn't, and it collapsed. And all the people that are dependent on the government all of a sudden found themselves not having any money, not having any food, not having anything, because they quit working pretty much because of the socialism. The people that were lazy didn't want to work, and they would originally get money from people that were working, but finally the people that were working wised up and said, well, why should we be working just so these parasites can get the food? So they quit working, and eventually it imploded on them. But there's also the spiritual implosion of a people that have denied the things of God and have went towards the government. Now, you can have a fairly decent setup, like the United States has a Constitution, a Declaration of Independence, and a Bill of Rights. All men are created equal. And some governments can be better than other governments. But the problem is when the government usurps the powers of God and does the opposite of what God says to do. Then you run into big problems. So with that, we will find out how this institution of the king started in our next chapter, chapter 9. I hope you'll join us. God bless.